Second Corinthians or in Acts chapter 14, it says that Paul was basically a mob turned on him and stoned him to death. So he gets stoned with rocks. He gets stoned in Lystra with rocks and dragged out of the city and left for dead. And then it says, and then he got back up and goes back in the city while they were all gathered around him. And then he says in 2 Corinthians 12, 14 years ago, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I'm not sure. Only God knows. But I was taken up into the third heaven, and I saw and heard and experienced things inexpressible, some things no one is allowed to tell. And then Paul talks about this spiritual body having new powers, buried in weakness, raised in power. And all these things he talks about correlates with what near-death experiencers report today. So they leave their body, they feel all these new powers of sight, telescopic vision, which, another fascinating thing. I mean, people say in their near-death experience, like I could see every vein on a leaf of a tree miles away, right? And interestingly, in the book of Revelation, John says he was also taken up into heaven, and he's looking at this city of God, and he says he was up on a very high mountain, and yet he says he read what was on the gates and the foundations, these names. Well, how? How do you do that from up on a very high mountain unless you have telescopic vision?
Right.
And yet again, this is exactly what indie ears around the world are attesting to. A welcoming committee. People say that they often, they travel through, many times it's a tunnel, but it's not always a tunnel. Sometimes it's like through outer space. But I mean, at super, the speed of light kind of speeds, and they come to this place of exquisite beauty. And many times they have this welcoming committee of people who died before them. Now, interestingly, Jesus in Matthew 13 says, use your worldly resources to make friends in this life. And then when it's all gone, they will welcome you into an eternal home. Fascinating. That's exactly what they experience. Like I said, in that same chapter, Jesus talks about how we will shine like the sun. I believe that's actually the experience of the very life and light and love of God that resonates and shines through us, and not always, which is fascinating. Because when people meet their loved ones, they don't always see them as this, human with light coming out of them. And by the way, often when that happens, they're wearing a particular robe, which is it took me a while to figure that out. You hear about that in near-death experiences. They were wearing these white robes, but that's also in the Bible as well. But what I finally realized is those white robes, I think, are not white at all. They're translucent. And somehow it's kind of like they let the light and the love of God shine out of us to others. And so, I mean, I can go on and on and on. Time. They say, near-death experiencers say time doesn't work the same way. Some of them say, well, there was no time. But I don't think that's it, because others say, no, there was time, but it didn't work the same way. And interestingly, in 2 Peter 3, this is one of Jesus' disciples, he says, don't forget that to the Lord, a 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. And in Imagine the God of Heaven, I talk about how, if we experience time in one dimension, right? So our time is linear, only going in one direction. You can never go back, and you can only go forward in one direction. But imagine if you had two dimensions of time. So imagine that timeline, and then on each point of that timeline, there's another timeline going north infinitely. So on every moment of a one-dimensional experience of time, you would have all the time in the world to experience that moment before you move to another moment.
Sure.
And then if you had three dimensions of time, imagine like more of a globe where the one dimension's the equator, and the second dimension are the longitudinal lines going up to one point of time, the North Pole. And so that would be a third dimension of time. So from that one point of time, you would experience the beginning and the end and simultaneously every point of time with all the time in the world.